Maybe not as exciting and inspiring as Lewis, but we hope to shed some light on a few things. So hello, my name is Sweta Shah. I'm the Global Advisor for Early Childhood Development with the Aga Khan Foundation. I have the great privilege today of chairing a plenary that's focused on the role of philanthropy in early childhood development and education in uncertainty. So over the last number of years, we've seen a real shift in the way foundations are working together. We've seen foundations coming together as coalitions around various topics because they've seen that they can make a bigger impact together versus being apart. So today we're going to hear from some of those foundations who are involved in a number of these groups, one of which is the International Education Funders Group, which brings together a number of foundations focused on education from the early years all the way to secondary. There's also the ECD Funders Group, which looks at specifically the early years. There's the Moving Minds Alliance, which looks at early childhood development in emergencies. There's also the Net Forward Group and many others. So there's a great deal of momentum, and so now let's hear from our esteemed panelists. I have here Khilen Nathwani with the Case Foundation. I also have Nada Al-Hajjri with Dubai Cares. I have Joyce Malombe with Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and I have Angela Dannemann with the Itaú Social Foundation. And we're going to start with Khilen.
Difficult to follow Lewis and lunch. I think it's great that we're here at OXSCIE 2018 talking about the educational responses to uncertainty. I think a lot of people have suggested that there's not been a better time to talk about this. And I would agree, but maybe for a slightly different reason. I think there's a bit of recency bias about thinking about the times we live in as being the most uncertain and fraught. We fear the rise of authoritarian populism now as we did in the first half of the 20th century. We fear the impact of disruptive technologies now like we did at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And we see threats to Western civilization like we did during the Cold War. I think though the pace of change might be increasing, I don't think we've ever really lived in periods of economic and social calm. So I would agree that there's never been a better time to talk about this, but that's because I think uncertainty is certain. And I think that as a society we've created systems and institutions that completely underprepare children for a world that's in constant flux. The tool that we have for preparing young people for this world that's always changing is education. But I think that we all know that the majority of schools and preschools teach children for the next set of exams. They don't focus on the development of the individual. Sir Ken Robinson talks about schools being a relic of an industrial revolution mode of production. Schools are like factories, and children are set in production lines getting passed through exams and grades, subjects. I have to say, personally, I hated school. I was, I was bored and uninspired, and as a result, I was labelled a bad kid. I think I probably spent about as much time outside the headmaster's office waiting to be told off again and again and again as I did in lessons, feeling inspired. That's an actual detention card, and what it says is I didn't attend lessons at the end of the last summer term. What it doesn't say is that I was in the pub. So what do we do about it? I think that the first thing we need to do is to reimagine education. I think what we used to think about education being a leveler is just not true. People who think education levels a playing field, it doesn't. We unfortunately live in a world where the greatest predictor of the future income of a child is the current income of their parents. I find that to be absolutely horrifying, to be honest with you. We need to evolve the existing systems and institutions so that they create environments where children can reach their potential and not just teaching them narrow ranges of experience. They need to be prepared for lifetimes of uncertainty. And one way to do that is to democratize the debate. And I think in OXSCIE what we've done today is today and yesterday is great. You know, we've started to listen to teachers and parents and students, and we need to do that more. I think for too long, the conversation, particularly around the early years, has been the preserve of policymakers and technocrats, but when you draw from a narrow range of voices and a narrow range of experiences, you always end up with a narrow range of outcomes. I think everyone in this room and everyone in general has a stake in the development of young people, because it is the development of society, so we need to be open to the idea of having a broader debate around what this looks like. And if there's one thing that I want everyone to come away from this very, very short talk, and OXSCIE 2018 in general, knowing and feeling and really truly believing it's that, we need to invest in the early years. We've heard lots of evidence as to why, so I'm just going to go through it very, very quickly, but number one, the physical evidence is absolutely overwhelming. That's a slide from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which shows the developmental trajectory of cortices involved with audiovisual processes, language, and high cognitive functioning. As you can see, it peaks in the early years and starts to tail off. There's strong correlations between early experiences and later life health outcomes. We know that the basis for our social and emotional templates are formed in early childhood, and there's strong evidence linking these to later life outcomes. We heard from Stephanie about the effects of toxic stress on later life outcomes, and that's just part of the evidence that shows how important this is. And the economic evidence to invest in early childhood is overwhelming. That's a summary of the work by Dr. James Heckman, Nobel laureate Professor James Heckman, lest we forget, showing that investment in the early years yields the greatest economic returns. The Copenhagen Consensus Institute, run by Bjorn Lomborg, has calculated that $1 invested in the early years in sub-Saharan Africa yields roughly a $13 return on investment. You don't find that everywhere. Yet, in spite of this, globally, in the developing world and in the UK and everywhere, we invest significantly more in the secondary and tertiary education spaces than we do in pre-primary and primary. If we want to invest in the future of society, this has to change. So what does philanthropy do about this? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is think long-term. Government funding is necessarily handicapped by political cycles, four-year voting periods. There's a need to show immediate results, to be able to prove what you've done to the people who voted for you. And the problem we have is that lots of us in philanthropy do the same thing. You know, we try to fix symptoms rather than causes. We try to do as much good as possible, as quickly as possible. But at the Case Foundation, you know, for example, we operate on the fact that we believe social change is difficult and slow and unpredictable, and so short-term funding doesn't really fit. It isn't congruous with that. We believe that to truly invest and to truly change societies, one has to make long-term commitments to change, and that involves long-term funding. We need to stay curious. Long-term investment requires a deep understanding of the world in which you operate. We need to be learning all the time, and that doesn't mean just reading academic papers, though I would recommend reading all the academic papers published by all the academics in this room, because it is genuinely fantastic. Or reading reports by NGOs and people in the development sector, again, apart from the reports published by the people in this room. We need to be learning from everyone. We need to be learning from parents, teachers, caregivers, and students. And there's two really big polar reasons for this. And the first one, and people don't like to talk about this, but I'm going to say it and it's true, is that philanthropy is fundamentally undemocratic. It isn't illiberal, but it's undemocratic because you get large amounts of money accumulated by elites within society who exist far from where social issues lie. And then this money is spent by small groups of people working in isolation. And I think the very, very least we should do is to make sure that the money we spend in this undemocratic way doesn't do any harm. And that's the first thing. But actually, more than that, the more you understand the system in which you operate, the better understanding you have of where the levers of change are. And the better chance you have of actually creating long-term change. And it's just a chance, you know, we're investing for the long term and it's a chaotic system, but you want to give yourself that best chance, you know. So at the Case Foundation, we put learning at the heart of our strategy. We try and publish learning documents all the time, and sometimes we even fund research, but actually, crucially, we think this allows us to be bold. It's Iris Apfel there for all of you. I think creating change in non-linear, chaotic systems requires an open attitude to risk. There's so much risk-averse money in the system. You know, risk-averse money looks to things that have been done before, finds comfort in certainty, goes to old methods all the time. But, you know, as the saying goes, and I think it might have been Henry Ford who said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. And I think that's absolutely true. I think philanthropists have to position themselves at the vanguard of development. We need to fund creativity and innovation. We need to stop being afraid of failure. We need to stop funding broken paradigms. You know, I think that we have always, and probably will always, live in uncertain times. But investing in the early years is truly investing in human potential and truly investing in the future of society. And I think by being committed, curious, and bold, I think philanthropy can and should play a key role in that. Thanks.
So thanks so much, Khilen. That was really great just to get an overview of the role of philanthropy and just highlighting that philanthropy can be flexible and nimble and can be creative and take risks. And I think that is really valuable when we're looking at education and early childhood development in times of uncertainty. And I think you laid out nicely also some of the critical reasons why looking at early years is really important, and specifically the first decade of life. And now Nada is going to take us through some of the work that Dubai Cares is doing, and specifically around the second decade of life.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to share the Dubai Cares story with you. But before I do, can I just very quickly say that OXSCIE is lit, and my daughter will freak out because she specifically warned me not to use that word. So, seriously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Dubai Cares, why research is important to us, and why we're super excited about Schools 2030. Dubai Cares is a UAE-based foundation. We support education in developing countries. We were founded in 2007, and we're very lucky to have amazing partners who work with us in the different countries where we work. We don't have a geographic focus. We work in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Pacific. So when Dubai Cares started, we focused on primary education, and then slowly we started realizing that there was a gap in the transition from early childhood to primary education. So we started investing in the early childhood education space. And then we also realized that the transition from primary into secondary was another gap, so we started investing in that space as well. And this was all before the Sustainable Development Goals came out. And at that time also, we became a partner with another group of foundations in a platform called the Partnership to Strengthen Innovation and Practice in Secondary Education, SIPSI. And through SIPSI, it provided us, I feel, with a safe environment to explore empowering youth, secondary education, what are the gaps, who are the partners, because at that time, the Millennium Development Goals were only focused on primary education, so there was a huge gap in secondary. We were lucky enough to be exposed to that environment because we learned a lot. We got to know many amazing partners. We got to be exposed to many different approaches. And Dubai Cares ended up funding 2 programs in Malawi through the SIPSI that helped us learn about ourselves as an organization, but also learn about the challenges that youth go through as they try to get an education. One of the examples I can mention is that one of our programs aimed to help the transition from primary into secondary school for girls. And what ended up happening was that in Malawi, the government secondary schools are not sufficient, so the communities have built something called Community Day Secondary Schools, and those are also overcrowded. So when our program aimed to improve the transition into secondary school, we ended up placing an unintended burden on the system that was already overwhelmed. Which was absolutely an unintended effect of the program, but it helped us understand that even though we do consultations with our partners, consultations with the government, consultations with other stakeholders in the countries where we work, it's not sufficient. And I don't know that we've identified where the disconnect is, but I think that's a gap also that we've identified. Aside from our Malawi examples, I am happy to say that after the Sustainable Development Goals came out, our board approved an expanded mandate for us, so we're looking at aligning fully with SDG 4. And that was very exciting news for us because it meant that we could fully move into funding youth empowerment and addressing all the huge gap in the I don't want to say secondary education only space because a lot of young children who drop out of or who transition out of primary schools don't necessarily have the opportunity or the ability to go to a secondary school. So we also want to be very intentional about not neglecting that segment of youth. I want to talk a little bit now about why research is important to us, and I'll walk you through our learning journey. When Dubai Cares was first founded, we've evolved as a foundation from supporting programs that only generate specific evidence for the program itself to thinking about how evidence can be used to influence wider spheres. So we don't only allocate specific budgets for M&E purposes. We don't only go and monitor and evaluate or commission external evaluations. We've started funding research that is not associated with our programs at all. And the one specific and very successful example that I can mention is our education, our E-cubed research envelope, which responds to the gap in education and emergencies. We launched this $10 million envelope 2 years ago, and it aims to generate evidence on what works and what doesn't work, and for whom and why in emergency settings. And we run it in partnership with INEE. And we have done one round already, and the second round is ongoing. And it's a very ambitious project, and I think it was very daring for Dubai Cares to think about that being a small foundation, because it's important, I think, for us to think outside of what we only work what we only support, and think about how we can really address gaps in the field beyond what we aim to do. I think I'm gonna now start talking about why we're excited about Schools 2030. And to be quite honest, one of the main reasons is because our partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation is a long-standing one. It's, it's been ongoing for a long time. It's survived many, many staff members coming and going. We have never invested in longitudinal studies before. So I think this will be, if we are to do it, I think the Aga Khan Foundation is the right partner. And in terms of what we think about can be addressed through Schools 2030, we've heard different conversations yesterday and today. What I heard coming out strongly is that there's a strong need for the research to be action-oriented and iterative, so that it can remain relevant. We've also heard internationally and here that we need to go beyond finding out what works and also look at for whom, where, and how, because context is key and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Also, something that we are thinking, I want to throw out a few questions to you about what we're thinking at Dubai Cares. So we're wondering about what skills are needed to empower youth. When we say skills, what do we mean? We talked about, in some of the sessions today, socio-emotional, we talked about 21st century, we talked about life skills. That's also something that's confusing to us at Dubai Cares. Another question we ask ourselves is, who defines which competencies to use? STEM versus humanities versus arts, do we have to choose? To what extent are we placing a burden on teachers by saying that they're the answer and they need to know it all and they need to do it all? Are we forgetting that there is an ecosystem surrounding students? And I think we're not, because I heard a lot of people acknowledging that there is a strong ecosystem around students that needs to be thought of when designing programs. Another question is, what is the role of the private sector and what is the extent of their influence? These are questions we're wondering about, and I don't have the answer for them now, but I'm hoping that as we start to design Schools 2030, we start to explore what makes sense together. Thank you. So
thanks so much, Nada. That was really great to get a sense of the interests of Dubai Cares and, some really interesting questions for us to think about as we, go forward in designing the second decade of life cohorts. So now I'd like to ask Angela Dannemann to talk a little bit about Brazil.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a joy to be here, and I would like to thank the Aga Khan Foundation first and foremost, and Dr. Andrew for inviting us. It's a pleasure to share with you and to talk about the possibility of being in Schools 2030, the first longitudinal that we would be involved with, a 10-year, because we've been doing things for 2 and 3 years, but not for 10 years, so that would be great. I would like to tell you a little about Itaú Social. It's a corporate foundation connected to Brazil's largest private bank. And Brazil has a tradition of finance being very much involved into philanthropy and education. It's not only Itaú that does it, but also the other big banks in Brazil as well. Well, am I doing something wrong? Yes, I am. Just to give you an idea what we work with, it's the main 2 lines of action that we work with is professional development, teachers, and also staff in state and city departments of education to keep the wire of pedagogy connected from the central office of the secretary all the way down to the schools. And this is a real disconnection in Brazil, not common to find the secretary knowing what pedagogy happens all the way down through the ladder. So this is what we do, trying to support training and professional development for these people. Discontinuity is a huge problem, as probably is in the rest of the world, in mandates of mayors, of governors, and together with them all the secretaries in the line. So sometimes it's not a 4-year mandate, sometimes it's a 2-year mandate. And this really bothers working of schools. And the second hand, we work with the strengthening of civil society organizations. Since last year, we have given it a little shift towards venture philanthropy, not only project-based grant making, because we have been observing and diagnosing and researching, and here comes the research part. It's transversal throughout the foundation. We do a lot of research in diagnostics and as well as in monitoring and evaluation, and in themes that are not directly connected to our programs, but are connected to the gaps in education in the country. So civil society organizations were suffering a lot by just the common model of project-based grant making. We now started a longer phase of investment, not only financially speaking, but also with technical assistance and capacitation, training, professional development, but in a dialogue with these organizations. So we do a pre-diagnostic, and then we sit down with them, and we dialogue about what was found and what are their needs, and we invest. This has started. It's going to take us 3 to 5 years to find out how good it is, but we will tell you about it as well. It's going to be longer. We work in a model of partnerships. This means we are a team of 47 people, but with a bigger team of 66 partners, which makes us able to go around Brazil like that. This is our map showing you the 2 lines of action. On one side, the public education initiatives with secretaries in most of the states, and sometimes in 2 or 3 different cities in the states. We have a different federation, as we say in Brazil, Brazilian style only. 27 states and 5,654 municipalities. And we have chosen to work especially with these 5,654 municipalities because we believe in local, as we were talking about here, with a global outlook. We have to work locally to make any difference. And on the other side is the philanthropy initiatives that we work very much in partnerships as well, in networks that we have been stimulating. Instead of working with one NGO, with a group of 50, 60, doing a middle scale work, not a small pilot, neither a large scale, because large scales have not proven as good as we wanted them to go. So, and I will point out a special study that we did, and our researchers is sitting down there in the chair. Fernanda, please stand up. It was done with just a picture now so you can see. This is in Portuguese, but there is an essay translated in English. It was done with young people from peripheries of big cities in Brazil, such as São Paulo, and this was specifically in São Paulo. Young people who are considered in the NEET category. They are not employed, are not not in school and not working in anything. So they live in very poor neighborhoods, very vulnerable, very violent, and they have trouble finding their own ways towards a civilized and citizenship life. So it's called the New Pathways Towards Opportunities, because they are finding their ways, and the study followed them for 2.5 years, finding some very interesting things about them. And one of the main things has been repeated here, especially the last time by Louis, who was here in the table before us, that the sense of belonging and of engagement with the adults or with mentors, sometimes with their peers as well as recommendation, is the essential part of education itself. Not dismissing and not disrespecting the role of schools and teachers that has to be changed, but this is very important for these kids. So I would like to let you see it. It's in our site. It's Itaú Social, the name of the foundation.org.br. This is a gift for Andy. And the book was done in a different format. This is a book. This is not a magazine. It's a book. And all the illustration was done by graffiti artists, young from the peripheries, as the subjects or the agents of the research. So it's an amazing study, and I would like to share it. The essay, Andy, you can distribute it, please, to all the people here, so you can get in touch with it. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Angela. And lastly, I'm pleased to invite Joyce Malombe from Wellspring to come and share some of her thoughts.
Good afternoon. After a very long 2 days, as I have sat there and listened about uncertainty, society, and education, a lot of memories come to mind. And somebody yesterday talked about how uncertain these days are for children, more than for anybody else, because they don't know what will happen tomorrow. I wanted to talk a little bit about what we are trying to do to kind of maybe ameliorate, not remove, the uncertainty that we see, the confusion that we see, and the opportunities that we feel could be made by foundations in terms of them fulfilling the gap, and now, and calming some of the nerves. I think that I'm from Kenya, and I think that, and I have seen outside organizations and donors inject uncertainty into different contexts. And we have had here all around us, we come with agendas, so I'm not saying you, we come with our own agendas. We have our own priorities, and funding sometimes can make or break processes and things in societies that we are supposed to build. And though it may not be intentional, a lot of that, we can also create competition among the people that we fund, and them starting to feel that if so-and-so knows what I'm doing, they may not, they will steal my secret recipe and go and do what I'm doing, and now they will be the ones getting the money. And well, there are many reasons why we do this. A lot of times we don't accept responsibility because nobody asks me to be accountable to whoever I fund. So we just kind of move from one strategy to the next, and we tell communities, we are not doing that anymore. And we drop the ball, a lot of times without announcing that we are dropping it. And so I just wanted us to think through, especially in philanthropy. We have discretionary funding that we can use to innovate, to bring change, to shake the system, although most times we cannot move the system. The system is too big for most of us to be able to have the dent that we need to have. But we have our own secret recipe because it is our money. So for philanthropy, what role in this mixture of uncertainty are we building? What are we doing with the system? And as the uncertainty increases for children, how do we do our business in such a way that we leave them, we can't be there forever, but we leave those communities a little bit more stable than we found them, or we leave paths that they can follow that will make sure what they are doing is not shaken. And I was thinking yesterday morning as I heard about the FUCA here and talking about that, when I went to school in rural Kenya, I knew if I work hard, I'll get there. You know, and I did. But many children today can't. And I think that is the biggest question we have to face. Why? And what is wrong, maybe, with what we are doing? So I work with Wellspring, and in our program, we focus on promoting and protecting the right to education for children globally, largely utilizing our experience in East Africa to test and demonstrate how this right can be realized to promote inclusion of all children, as well as the quality and and also how we can make how we can support the government and others to be accountable in the education system. And so we tend to focus on public education and the government. We realize actually that we can influence, but we cannot move the thing. This is the one thing that the government owns, whether we accept it or not, at least in Africa. And I like to say that sometimes this is the last colony. They will not let go. And since we know that, what is our role in trying to help influence this? They shouldn't let go, but we cannot still continue doing the things that we have been doing. So we need each other, government, civil society, philanthropic organizations. We need everybody on the table there, and we realize that. And so when we started our program, we invested in a number of some 40 or 50 organizations, and we were looking for innovations in improving education outcomes, and which is a very difficult, narrow thing there. And so we found a lot of things happening with the different groups, interesting ones, some of them out of the mainline, because they are talking about parental engagement. I know it's talked about that here. They are talking about mentoring. They are talking about working with emotional whatever of children and all those kinds of things. So we looked at it and we said, what do we do with this? And instead of us deciding what we do with this, we went back to the grantees and asked them, what do you need to move this thing to the next point? And we also decided at that point that we would involve the government and ask government people to come and talk about challenges and opportunities, knowing that they will bring a laundry list of things that they think we can do that we can do. And they didn't in some of the countries. And after doing that, I want to talk about what you see ahead of you. So we were afraid when we went there, what if they ask things that we can't do? And what if what they ask is too big for us and we don't have that kind of funding? But we decided to go anyway and take the risk. And so some of the things that we had there was that they need support in monitoring and evaluation to know exactly what works and what doesn't work. They needed support to figure out how they translate what they do into policy, because you are doing one small thing here, another one here, and some big things. How do we bring our efforts together and do this? And how do we learn from one another across the region and across the country? And it was like, what do you mean? Okay, we knew what they meant, but who can do that? And then they said, so we need help with communication. How do we change, how do we translate what we do? And so for us, after listening, so we asked the government, what do you want to hear? And the government said, we don't want to hear from 20 groups, we just want to hear 3 or 4 things that we should do. And so we gotten into this risky affair where we have formed what we are calling Regional Education Learning Initiative in East Africa, where I told you we are trying to demonstrate what works and what doesn't work. And within that, we have tried to really, our main goal is effective, influential organizations. Whether you are small or big, that you will be doing what you are doing efficiently, and you will have other people around that you can work with. So we focus on collaboration, how you can collaborate with each other. And there was a lot of fear initially about that, and we can see that now going. Then we decided in-country monitoring and evaluation so that we can develop indicators that go around the issue of improving education outcomes. And so each country has a male mentor. We don't call them experts because the organizations know. They just don't know how to put it together. And then we have also a coordinating agency that we are using and working very closely with on a daily basis. And we have a policy arm. We are trying to influence policy. And each of these organizations has worked with policy at the local level, but they don't know how to filter the stuff up. So we have a communication group that is working with these organizations and trying to help them figure that out. But the main focus is learning, collaboration, putting 2 or 3 things at the country level, how we can influence policy. And so whether you are a small organization or you are a big one, your voice matters. And just, and then the big organizations, if they have skills that they can pass to the small organization, they can do that. And then the small ones can bring their evidence. So we want evidence-based practice and policy. And that is where we think the role of research, the role of tracking what they are doing, the role of strengthening them is going to be very key. And I think I have 1 minute or so to end this. This is work at its beginning stages. It is difficult, but it is absolutely very encouraging. We have to give the power back to the people and really figure out a way of enabling them solve their problems and reducing the instability that we create with our funding. I want to give one small example. In Tanzania, we got them together at the country level, and they were talking about equity and inclusive education, and about 7 or so organizations, everybody is trying their small thing here and saying we can't reach the policy. People, we don't know where to go, we don't know the path there. And I was overhearing this sitting in another group, and one of them says, but we are sitting in that committee. And then he said, can you put all your ideas together and bring them? We will put them in a sequence and go and present them. They may be accepted or rejected, but we can do that. And I remember one organization from a university saying, we didn't know anybody has access to this mechanism, this can happen. And so they did. And January, when I went back to Nairobi, they were there saying, to Tanzania, they were there saying, you can't believe it, you can't believe it, you can't believe it. They took everything except one suggestion. And so the policy on people with disabilities in Tanzania will be influenced moving forward by groups that never thought they will ever see anything in policy. So while it is messy and difficult, we have some quick wins and we have some difficult things to work through. But we are not doing that alone. We are doing them with the systems that are there. And while it is at the beginning, we are hoping that we can give the power back to the grassroots. They are engaged in parental engagement, which the government is asking in Kenya, we don't know how to do this, how can you help? And they are able to feed in whatever they are doing into policy, the new curriculum reform. And while there are bumps, a lot can be done. So we are not claiming victory yet, but we are encouraged by what we see. And I hope we can ask ourselves, how do we move this thing from here? We have the theories, we have everything, and all those things that we are doing. What about that child who is uncertain today, whether they will finish standard 1 or 2, whether they will go anywhere, and whether there is a tomorrow? And that teacher who is not being paid and doesn't see the point. Is there a way we can figure out those mothers who are going there and trying to bring food to the children? Is there a way to join forces with them and build better schools and open spaces for children that are now closed? Because a lot of times we want to control the process. When you decide to do it this way, a lot is out of control, but it is transformative. And we hope we will live to see big changes in the future. So schools 2030 is an important business for us to watch the system and see what happens and not depend on our aspirations or what we think we are doing. We hope we can actually see the impact of the things that we do and whether we are damaging or whether we are building a better tomorrow, not just talking about it and patting ourselves on the back, but really engaging in a policy that brings sustainable change, not necessarily sustainable organizations, but sustainable children change and changes the face of children in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and beyond. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Joyce, for highlighting the importance again of listening to the grassroots and making sure their voices are heard. So we have a few minutes now before we have our next coffee and tea break for questions. So if any of you have any questions for any of our panelists, please raise your hand and we have a few minutes to take them on. So we have a question up there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody on the panel. I'm Peter Hinton. I work with Optimizer, who are an impact investor in education and health in East Africa, and also with Capital Plus, trying to get money into low-cost schools. I'm just interested in terms of, it was mentioned once, in terms of your experience of actually investing in the education space, particularly in Africa, what you've seen to work and what you've seen not to work.
That is why we are a little bit blank. But I think that programs that are grounded in the space and the place where they are, and they are led by communities, and we are creating space for those organizations that are working there to really do what they think it is. So, which means flexibility as you do your program. A lot of times we have to change things in midstream because a lot of times they're also not sure about what they're trying to do. And so because we ourselves are working a lot with innovations, it is giving space for them to really experiment with different things. And once the experiment sometimes says that they were going not necessarily where they needed to go, we have opened up the space for them to go a different route. So I think a lot is unknown, and a lot of what we think we know, even ourselves, we find that it operates differently at that local level. So it is listening. And I think it is very difficult to give power to communities. Because, of course, we are making grants and we have strategies and we are being pushed somewhere at the back. But I think we can create an open discourse and dialogue with the people that we are helping and not want to tell so much. Somebody yesterday said, listen and work with them. And then figure out with them, what is it that they need? Some of them are technical ways of just how do you say what you are doing and how do you put it in words that can help you move to the next point? Because sometimes we are talking the same language and they are not hearing. So I think work that is based on some, I don't want to call it research, but tracking with clarity what we are trying to do or helping clarify that, and then really figuring out how we can ground it there. Seems to be what is working. The communities and the people that work there have to own this process. Otherwise, they will do and dance to your rhythm, and once you leave, once you just get out like this, they will say, now we are done. Let's do what we wanted to do in the first place. So we don't want to repeat that.
So not only in Africa, but generally speaking, from our experience, programs that have learning and feedback loops incorporated from the onset and the ability and flexibility to adjust the design accordingly are the ones that are most successful and most impactful. And the ones that are rigidly designed according to certain donor criteria are the ones that often struggle the most.
I have no experience in East Africa, but a lot in Brazil. And one of the things that you should not do is try to impose a program into a network, a system of schools that has already public policy, you should be aligned with the public policy. If it's good, if it's not good, try to promote change in the public policy and then go in helping. It's no use trying. We had a lot of programs coming up from the outside and being terrible for the education in the country.
Yeah, so one thing that it sort of strikes me with regards to investing in education, certainly, and I take it you're talking about sort of social enterprise stuff, is that I think I'm always mindful when I look at such ideas about where the line is drawn between cost effectiveness and quality. I've yet to see particularly good examples of where organisations have managed to cover their own costs and actually provide good learning environments. They can sometimes provide what look like good outcomes, but actually good outcomes in very narrow ranges, and what things that don't look like satisfactory schooling experiences. I mean, so that's just the one thing that I would say with regards to that.
So perhaps as chair, I can quickly also address that. So I think one thing that philanthropy has done well, from what I've seen so far, is the fact that different foundations are coming together to co-fund activities, I think makes a difference. And then taking risks on projects, which can then leverage additional funding. So one example, I'm going to call out Sesame Street, because Danny is here with us. So the Open Society Foundation, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, put in a little bit of money to support Sesame Street and the International Rescue Committee, a small pilot, which they tried their activities, and they leveraged $100 million from MacArthur Foundation. So I think that's one way that philanthropy can really, foundations, small foundations, even by putting in 50,000, 100,000, can really leverage others. The other thing that I've seen in my experience is that foundations like to talk to each other about what each other is funding. And so sometimes a foundation will support a project or co-invest because they actually want to work with another foundation and build that relationship. So I think those are really important ways to leverage and to just increase the overall pot. And that's why I think a lot of these coalitions that are forming the IEFG, the ECD Funders Group, the Moving Alliance, Net Forward, all these have the potential really to unlock a lot of funding that can really take projects to scale.
And on that note, Sweta, I was going to ask exactly about that. And there are some really good initiatives taking place between foundations everywhere. But back in South Africa, we formed a group called IPASA, the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa. And the more we got, it's about its 7th year now, and the deeper we got, the better we got to know each other, the more we started doing together. And one thing that I would like to ask Khilen about is there anything like that here where the one failing of IPASA that I saw was that we didn't have common purpose? Because I think if philanthropy, and exactly what you said, we subscribe to, you and I have agreed to talk anyway, but I wanted to put it out in public now that if we all get together and create more common purpose, because we do have the power to make things happen. And if we do it in a conscious and aware way, we can really start leveraging change. Is there anything like that in the UK, for instance, or elsewhere?
In the UK, so working in the UK or organisations based in the UK, or both? So IEFG is a really good one, and I would say they're probably one of the stronger ones. I mean, I think to your point, I'd agree with you completely, and I think sometimes what the barrier to that is organisations looking to create change in certain ways rather than just to create change. And so I think when it comes to philanthropy, it's really important to be flexible about the routes you take within certain very broad ethical sort of guidelines, but you sort of know the future you want to see, you know the vision you have, and the ability to be flexible gives you the ability to be collaborative as well. I think often what happens is that organisations come with very set ways of doing things, and boards of directors who don't understand that change is good, and then often just end up falling over on that. But I mean, in terms of what's out there in terms of funding education, IEFG is a brilliant one. I'll have a look at them, and there are loads which I probably can't remember, which maybe the rest of the panel here can fill in the blanks with.
There's a lot going on in Brazil in terms of collaboration on a purpose. There are 2 groups inside of Brazil's Council on Foundations. The name there is GIFE, IFE. We have two very big collaborations. One is on reading and writing with quality. It's a group of approximately 100 foundations and institutions, not-for-profit. The other one is looking towards the rights of young children. This group has made the Brazilian federal government sign a global pact against violence towards children. This is another one. And another very interesting one, we were talking about technology yesterday, is a smaller group of 5 foundations that is looking towards technology and connectivity for secondary schools, public schools in Brazil, together with not only private banks, but development banks and governmental banks, and pressing towards having more technology in schools, not only in labs, but throughout with wireless and connectivity in the classrooms.
I can mention an additional example. I mean, IFG is definitely the strongest, and there was the Partnership for Secondary Education, which I mentioned earlier. But I think for early childhood development, there's a small group of foundations. I think, I don't know the name of the group, but it's led by the Bernard van Leer Foundation. I can find out more information for you if you're interested. But I think one thing to caution there is that it's very important when we get together as foundations to form collaboratives to think about a very strong vision of what the purpose of that collaboration is and what it's feeding into. Because collaborating for the sake of collaborating will not get you very far. So and at Dubai Cares, we've recognized that, and we're starting to think more consciously about which groups we need to belong to.
Wait, so just to clarify, the ECD group is the ECD Funders Group, and it's being co-led by the Bernard van Leer Foundation, Open Society Foundation, and Hilton Foundation. So thank you, everyone, for your time today. If you have some more questions, we have time during the coffee and tea break that you can come to ask questions to the panelists. And Andy is in the same area, right? And we have, okay, Andy's going to come up and give us instructions.
But first,
yeah.